To understand the beginning of a story, one must look to what was left behind. To comprehend the germination of the Second World War, we must retreat to the end of the Great War, the one that was supposed to be the last. In 1919, the world lay devastated. Millions of lives were lost, empires crumbled, and civilization had brushed against the abyss. The victors, France, Britain, and the United States, gathered at Versailles to dictate the peace. What was born from those negotiations was not a lasting agreement, but a punishment. And that punishment sowed the seed of resentment and revenge. The Treaty of Versailles, signed by a German delegation forced to accept it without negotiation, was a total humiliation. Its terms were harsh and punitive. Germany was assigned sole guilt for starting the war, a legal basis for all other sanctions. German territory was dismembered, losing colonies and European lands rich in coal and minerals. National pride, already wounded, disintegrated. But the most unsustainable element was the war reparations, an astronomical sum equivalent to over 500 billion modern dollars that was impossible to pay. Economists like Britain's John Maynard Keynes warned these conditions would drown the German economy and destabilize all of Europe. Their warnings were ignored. A nation already traumatized by defeat was plunged into profound economic misery. Hyperinflation reached unimaginable levels. People carried wheelbarrows of cash to buy a loaf of bread. The value of money evaporated overnight, destroying the savings of the middle class. The Weimar Republic, the new democratic government, was perceived by many as a weak creation of the victors, incapable of defending the people's interests. This humiliation, resentment, and economic despair was the perfect soil for extreme ideas to flourish. People desperately sought a figure, a movement that promised to restore lost honor and avenge the injustices of Versailles. The stage was set for leaders who knew how to exploit fear and hatred. The ghost of the Great War had not been buried. It whispered promises of revenge in the minds of a people who just wanted to believe in themselves again. The German people felt betrayed, not only by the world, but by their own leaders. They believed the peace promises of U.S. MSEC President Woodrow Wilson, based on self-determination, had been ignored and replaced by a vengeful treaty. The war guilt clause was a thorn in national pride. This sentiment was the perfect breeding ground for extremist movements, which promised to restore national glory and undo Versailles injustices. Moderate political parties faltered, unable to offer quick solutions to the misery and chaos. In this vacuum of power and hope, radically nationalist figures gained strength, like the National Socialist Party, which knew how to exploit public frustration. Meanwhile, on the international scene, the achieved peace was fragile. The League of Nations, created to prevent future conflicts, proved ineffective and apathetic. Though noble in intention, it lacked military power or the authority to enforce its decisions, functioning more as a debate forum than a true international arbiter. The victorious nations, exhausted by war, showed great international apathy. Britain focused on its vast empire, and France was more concerned with its own security, building the impregnable, or so they believed, Maginot Line on its border with Germany. The United States, with its isolationist doctrine, refused to join the League of Nations, stripping it of moral authority immediately. This power vacuum, and lack of a strong international voice, allowed the aggressions of totalitarian regimes to grow without significant opposition. Dictators quickly understood that the inaction and fear of democratic powers were their greatest allies. Peace was merely an illusion maintained by inertia, and soon the winds of war would blow over Europe and the world again. With the table set by German resentment and international fragility, the stage was clear for the rise of a man who knew how to exploit those passions and fears: Adolf Hitler. Hitler rose to power through politics, exploiting the weaknesses of the Weimar Republic. His National Socialist German Workers' Party was a minor movement at first, but gained popularity with a clear, seductive message. He blamed all of Germany's problems on the Weimar Republic, the communists, and above all, the Jews, whom he presented as the cause of defeat in the Great War and the economic crisis. His speech, full of promises to restore national greatness, resonated with a population desperate for a strong leader. In 1933, during a political crisis, Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. Once in power, he swiftly consolidated his control. Within a year, he eliminated all opposition. The Reichstag fire served as his pretext to suspend civil liberties and persecute communists. The Enabling Act later gave him dictatorial powers, allowing him to rule without parliament. The elimination of opposition was systematic and brutal. Unions, political parties, and any critical voice were banned. The secret police, the Gestapo, silenced dissenters. With power in his hands, Hitler dedicated himself to fulfilling his promise to restore German pride. He publicly scorned the Treaty of Versailles and began the secret rearmament of Germany. While the League of Nations and Western powers looked the other way, the army expanded, new weapons factories were built, and warplanes were developed. He broke the naval limits imposed by the treaty, and even remilitarized the Rhineland without anyone intervening. Each action was a test of his strength and his adversary's weakness. With each step, Germany grew stronger, while the world convinced itself Hitler was not a real threat. Adolf Hitler was born in 1889 in a small Austrian town. A figure who, despite humble origins, would change the course of history. His childhood was marked by a conflictual relationship with his strict customs official father and the unconditional love of his mother, whose death from cancer in 1907 affected him deeply. Unlike his father, the young Adolf dreamed of being an artist, a painter of grand landscapes. However, his dream was frustrated when he was twice rejected by the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts. After his mother's death, Hitler moved to Vienna, living in poverty, earning a living by selling postcards he painted himself. It was in the capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a multicultural and diverse city, that his ideology began to form a toxic mix of radical German nationalism, anti-Semitism, and racism. Vienna was then a hotbed of nationalist ideas and racist theories, and Hitler, surrounded by poverty and frustration, absorbed these ideas like a balm for his failures. The outbreak of the Great War in 1914 was a liberation for Hitler. He enlisted in the German army as a volunteer, motivated by a nationalist fervor for the nation he considered his true homeland. He served as a messenger on the Western Front, an extremely dangerous job, and was wounded twice. He was awarded the Iron Cross, First Class, for bravery and honor. He valued immensely. For him, the war was a transcendental experience, and the camaraderie in the trenches was the first time in his life. He felt he belonged to something, However, Germany's defeat was a devastating blow. Hitler, recovering in a hospital from a mustard gas attack, could not comprehend how an army he considered invincible could have been defeated. The explanation he found and embraced with fanaticism was that of the stab in the back. He believed Germany had not been defeated on the battlefield, but had been betrayed by the politicians of the Weimar Republic, the socialists, and above all, the Jews, whom he accused of being a corrosive influence on the nation. After the war, Hitler joined a small, unknown political party in Munich, the German Workers' Party, which later became the National Socialist German Workers' Party. At that moment, they were only a handful of people. Quickly, his charismatic oratory and ability to connect with people's frustrations catapulted him to leadership. In the Munich beer halls, where the party held its meetings, Hitler refined his message, blaming Germany's problems on the Treaty of Versailles, communism, and the Jews. His speech, full of hatred and promises of revenge, attracted disillusioned war veterans, unemployed workers, and a middle class suffocated by hyperinflation. In 1923, he attempted a failed coup known as the Beer Hall Putsch, which ended with his arrest and imprisonment. This setback, however, proved to be a turning point. During his time in prison, he wrote Mein Kampf, a manifesto in which he outlined his plans for Germany, his worldview, and his ideology. After his release, he realized he could not take power by force, but had to do so through legal means, exploiting the weaknesses of the Weimar democratic system. And so he did. With the arrival of the Great Depression in 1929, the German economy collapsed. Millions lost their jobs, and misery spread throughout the country. The Nazi Party, with its simple message and radical promises, gained increasing popular support. Elections followed one after another, and Hitler's party, which had only a few seats, became the largest in the German parliament. On January 13, 1933, amid political crisis, Germany's conservative leaders convinced President Hindenburg to appoint Adolf Hitler as chancellor, believing they could control him. They fatally underestimated the fanaticism and ambition of the failed artist and war veteran. The moment he took the oath, Hitler ceased to be a mere agitator and became the leader of a nation with the power to enact his darkest plans. Benito Mussolini, born in 1883 to a socialist blacksmith and a Catholic school teacher, began as a revolutionary socialist. The Great War transformed him. He broke with pacifist socialism and embraced nationalism. In post-war Italy's chaos, he founded the fascist combat squads. His black shirts used violence against political opponents. In 1922, the March on Romea political bluffed King Victor Emmanuel III to hand him power. Mussolini dismantled democracy, banned rival parties, and established a totalitarian state under Il Duce. His dream was to restore the Roman Empire's glory. He launched the battle for grain and vast public works. In 1935, he invaded Ethiopia with tanks, planes, and mustard gas. The League of Nations issued weak condemnations, but no real action. The conquest demonstrated the League's impotence and showed Hitler that Western powers would not risk war to stop aggression. The Rome-Berlin axis tightened, and the world edged closer to global conflict. Japanese militarism found its sharpest instrument in General Hideki Tojo, born in 1884 into a samurai family, nicknamed the Razor for his sharp, pitiless mind. He was not a charismatic demagogue, but a military bureaucrat. By the Sendas, power in Japan had shifted from civilians to the army, which believed expansion was necessary for survival. Tojo became war minister in 1940 and prime minister in 1941. The ideology was Asia for the Asians, which in practice meant Asia under Japanese domination. The first major step was the 1931 invasion of Manchuria, engineered by the army via a fabricated railway incident. The League of Nations condemned it, but did nothing. Japan simply withdrew from the League. This success emboldened the militarists, paving the way for wider war with China and ultimately, the Pacific conflict. The path to global war was now irreversible. The democratic West, particularly Britain and France, responded to totalitarian advances with a policy of appeasement. Exhausted from the Great War and the Depression, their populations dreaded another bloodbath. Many also felt the Treaty of Versailles had been too harsh on Germany. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, umbrella in hand, became its symbol. The apex was the 1938 Munich Pact, which handed the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia to Germany. Without consulting the Czechs, Chamberlain returned to London waving the agreement, declaring peace for our time. The illusion shattered in March 1939 when Hitler invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia. Appeasement had not satisfied the dictators. It had emboldened them. Throughout the Sendas, one firm, solitary voice warned of the gathering storm. Winston Churchill, born in 1874 into aristocracy, he had a long, erratic public life as a soldier, journalist, and minister. While Britain embraced appeasement, Churchill, then out of government, used his seat in Parliament to denounce Hitler's intentions. He saw German rearmament, the annexation of Austria, and the betrayal of Czechoslovakia not as just rectifications but as deliberate steps by an expanding war machine. After Munich, he famously declared, "You were given the choice between war and dishonor. You chose dishonor, and you will have war." The press ridiculed him. Colleagues saw him as an alarmist, but his clarity and persistence made him the inevitable leader when crisis came. After Germany invaded Poland in 1939 and Chamberlain fell, it was Churchill, the eternal dissenter, who was called to lead a nation on the brink of disaster. He assumed the premiership in May of 1940, just as the Battle of France was lost and the shadow of invasion fell over Britain. His role as the voice warning of the coming storm is a fundamental chapter in the story of how the conflict began. The final link in the chain was a cynical alliance between two ideologically opposed totalitarian regimes, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. On August 23, 1939, German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop flew to Moscow to sign the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with his Soviet counterpart. The public non-aggression treaty shocked the world, but a secret protocol held a more sinister plan: the division of Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Germany would take Western Poland and Lithuania, while the Soviet Union annexed Eastern Poland, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Bessarabia. For Hitler, the pact avoided a two-front war and gave a green light to invade Poland. For Stalin, it bought time to modernize the Red Army and create a buffer zone. Both leaders knew a future aggression was inevitable. With this pact, the last obstacle was removed. At 4:45 a.m. on September 1, 1939, without a formal declaration, Nazi Germany attacked Poland. This was not conventional war, but the terrifying new strategy of Blitzkrieg lightning war. It relied on speed, surprise, and the coordinated assault of panzer tank divisions, motorized infantry, and the Luftwaffe acting as flying artillery. Polish forces, with outdated equipment and cavalry, stood no chance. The invasion was marked by military efficiency and the brutal ideology of the Wehrmacht, which committed atrocities against civilians. On September 17, the Soviet Union invaded from the east, fulfilling the secret protocol. Poland, crushed between two forces, surrendered. This was the demonstration of a new, brutal form of warfare. Though Britain and France declared war on September 3, their promise to aid Poland faded. The Allies mobilized but assumed a defensive posture behind France's Maginot Line. This period of profound inaction became known as the Funny War, or Sitzkrieg, the Sitting War. Beyond minor patrols and propaganda leaflet drops, an uneasy silence fell on the Western Front. The Allies hoped economic blockade and time would weaken Germany, but this was a catastrophic failure. Hitler used the pause to replenish forces and plan his next offensive. The silence was not peace, but the prelude to a storm. That storm next broke in the frozen Scandinavian peninsula. On April 9, 1940, Germany launched Operation Weserübung, invading Denmark and Norway. The strategic goal was control of Swedish iron ore routes. Denmark fell in hours. Norway required a bold naval and aerial assault, with paratroopers seizing key airfields. British and French troops landed to aid Norwegian resistance, leading to the first real ground battles between Axis and Allied forces, particularly around Narvik. Despite initial Allied successes, German air superiority made the position untenable. The Norwegian defeat forced British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain to resign. In his place stood the indomitable Winston Churchill, the eternal opponent of appeasement. The Funny War was over forever. While the democratic powers were distracted by the campaign in Norway, Hitler prepared his master stroke, the blow that would unleash one of the fastest and most humiliating defeats in modern history. On May 10, 1940, the Wehrmacht launched a massive assault. The French, supported by the British Expeditionary Force, expected a repeat of the Great War. Their strategy centered on the impenetrable Maginot Line fortifications along the German border. Yet German generals, like Erich von Manstein and Heinz Guderian, had conceived a daring new plan. They would flank the line by concentrating their panzer forces through the dense Ardennes forest, a sector the French considered impassable for tanks. The German gamble worked with astonishing speed. Panzer divisions surged through the Ardennes, achieving a deep breakthrough that severed Allied supply lines. Guderian's tanks, operating under the Blitzkrieg doctrine, did not stop to consolidate gains. Their sole mission was to advance, sowing chaos. The German spearhead reached the English Channel, trapping French and British forces in the north. The mighty Maginot Line was rendered irrelevant, simply bypassed. A brutal lesson on the obsolescence of static defense in the age of mechanized war. The architect of this success was General Heinz Guderian, a visionary who understood tanks as a primary offensive weapon, not mere infantry support. In France, he ignored cautious orders, pushing his panzers relentlessly to the coast. His audacity and speed cut the Allied armies in two. For the French, defeat was personified by Marshal Philippe Pétain, the 84-year-old hero of Verdun. Viewing the collapse as irreversible, his primary goal became negotiating a surrender to avoid total destruction. On June 22, 1940, France signed an armistice. A collaborationist government was established in the spa town of Vichy, governing the southern half of the country nominally, while the north, including Paris, fell under direct Nazi occupation. Pétain, the former savior, now led a regime that betrayed its democratic ideals. As Guderian's panzers split France, a human drama unfolded on the Channel coast. At the small beach of Dunkirk, over 400,000 encircled Allied soldiers faced annihilation. What followed was Operation Dynamo, the evacuation of Dunkirk, with the Royal Navy's large ships unable to approach the shallow beaches. A public call for help summoned an unprecedented armada of civilian vessels, yachts, fishing boats, and lifeboats, the little ships of Dunkirk. They served as ferries under constant attack from the Luftwaffe, while the Royal Air Force fought desperate aerial battles overhead. Against all odds, in just 10 days, over 338,000 men were evacuated, saving the core of the British Army. In Britain, it was not a military victory, but a miraculous triumph of spirit, a moral lifeline in Britain's darkest hour. After the fall of France, Britain stood alone. Winston Churchill promised never to surrender, and the nation prepared for the inevitable invasion. Hitler's plan, Operation Sea Lion, required annihilating the Royal Air Force to gain air superiority. Thus began the Battle of Britain in the summer of 1940, the first major battle fought entirely in the air. The Luftwaffe, a formidable veteran force, sought to destroy RAF airfields, radar stations, and aircraft factories. Though outnumbered, RAF pilots in their Spitfires and Hurricanes defended tirelessly. The decisive factor was not an aircraft, but a technological advance: radar. Britain's advanced radar system could detect incoming German bomber formations over 100 km away, allowing the RAF to conserve its precious few squadrons and scramble them at the exact moment to intercept. This crucial advantage would tip the scales in a battle for national survival. As the Battle of Britain wore on, Hitler's frustration grew. To break British morale, he shifted strategy from bombing airfields to terrorizing cities, beginning the Blitz on September 7th. For 57 consecutive nights, German bombers rained destruction upon London. Yet, instead of surrender, the attacks forged a hardened resilience as citizens sheltered in tube stations and basements. Unknowingly, Hitler granted the RAF a vital respite. Airfields and factories recovered, allowing Britain to fight on. By autumn, Operation Sea Lion was postponed indefinitely. It was not a crushing victory, but a decisive moral triumph. Britain would not yield. While Britain endured the Blitz, a crucial struggle unfolded in the North African desert. Control of the Suez Canal and Middle Eastern oil was vital. Initially a back-and-forth affair against ill-prepared Italian forces, the campaign transformed in early 1941 with the arrival of General Erwin Rommel, a master of mobile warfare. His Afrika Corps achieved stunning victories, pushing Allied forces to the brink of Egypt. To counter him, the British sent General Bernard Montgomery in August 1942. Meticulous and confident, Montgomery vowed no more retreats. Their decisive clash came at the Second Battle of El Alamein in October. With overwhelming strength, Montgomery launched a sustained assault. Rommel, his supply lines stretched and forces exhausted, could not hold. The victory at El Alamein saved Egypt and marked the Allies' first major land triumph, beginning the end of Axis ambitions in Africa. With North Africa secured, Hitler turned to the Balkans, needing to protect his southern flank before invading the Soviet Union. In April 1941, a brutal Blitzkrieg overran Yugoslavia and Greece with overwhelming speed. Though successful, the campaign cost Hitler a precious month, delaying his planned spring invasion of Russia, a delay that would prove catastrophic. On June 22, 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in history. Over 4 million Axis troops stormed across a 1,600-kilometer front. Initial success was staggering, with millions of Soviet soldiers captured, but Hitler had planned for a short war. By autumn, the advance slowed in mud, and then halted in an early, brutal winter. German equipment failed in temperatures far below zero. Soldiers froze in summer uniforms. At Moscow's gates, Soviet General Georgy Zhukov organized a desperate defense. In December, he launched a massive counteroffensive with winter-equipped troops, driving the exhausted Germans back. The myth of German invincibility was broken. The Eastern Front would become a protracted war of attrition, deciding the fate of the global conflict. Meanwhile, tensions between Japan and the United States escalated. Facing an American oil embargo, Japan chose conflict. On the quiet Sunday morning of December 7, 1941, they delivered their answer. Without a declaration of war, Imperial Japanese Navy aircraft launched a surprise attack on the Pearl Harbor Naval Base in Hawaii. The assault was a devastating success. In under 2 hours, the U.S. Pacific Fleet was crippled. 18 warships sunk or disabled, including 8 battleships, and over 2,500 servicemen killed. It was a calculated strategic move to neutralize American power, granting Japan time to expand its empire. Yet, in a monumental miscalculation, the attackers missed the American aircraft carriers at sea, along with repair facilities and fuel depots assets that would prove crucial. The architect was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of Japan's combined fleet. Having studied at Harvard, Yamamoto understood American industrial might and opposed the war, predicting Japan would have only 6 months of success. He hoped a shocking blow might deter U.S. entry. Instead, it unified a divided nation. President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed Congress, calling December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. War was declared almost unanimously. Germany and Italy, Japan's allies, then declared war on the United States, a grave error by Hitler. Pearl Harbor transformed a European conflict into a global war, mobilizing America's vast resources. By spring 1942, Hitler shifted focus to southern Russia, targeting the Caucasus oil fields and the city of Stalingrad on the Volga River. What began as a secondary objective became the war's bloodiest battle. The German Sixth Army, under Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, advanced successfully at first, reducing the city to rubble. But Soviet forces, under Stalin's not one step back order, clung to every street and building. The fighting devolved into brutal, urban warfare. As winter approached, Paulus' exhausted troops were trapped. In November, Soviet Operation Uranus encircled the Sixth Army. Hitler refused retreat, promising impossible air supplies. Inside the pocket, conditions were inhuman. Soldiers succumbed to starvation and frost. In late January 1943, Paulus, newly promoted to Field Marshal, surrendered. An entire German army was captured. German losses exceeded 800,000. Stalingrad was a decisive turning point. The Eastern Front collapsed and the initiative passed to the Soviets. In the Pacific, the Battle of Midway proved equally pivotal. Japanese Admiral Yamamoto planned to lure the U.S. fleet into a trap near Midway Island. This time, however, American cryptographers had broken the Japanese naval code, JN-25. Learning the target was AF, confirmed as Midway via a ruse about water shortages. Admiral Chester Nimitz used this intelligence to set an ambush. From June 4-7, 1942, American dive bombers, launched from carriers, caught the Japanese fleet unprepared, sinking 4 of its aircraft carriers in a single day. Japan lost its most experienced pilots and strategic initiative. Midway marked the start of the long island-hopping campaign toward Japan's eventual surrender. In North Africa, General Erwin Rommel's advance into Egypt stalled by mid-1942. His supply lines overextended. British forces, now under General Bernard Montgomery, received steady reinforcements. The Second Battle of El Alamein began in October. Montgomery, with a 2-to-1 advantage, employed a strategy of attrition, massive artillery barrages followed by relentless frontal assaults. Rommel's weakened forces could not hold. After nearly 2 weeks, Rommel ordered a retreat, defying Hitler's command to stand fast. The victory secured the Suez Canal and Middle Eastern oil fields. Churchill later said, "Before Alamein we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat." It lifted Allied morale and marked a turning point in the Desert War. Amid these battles, a secret ideological war was waged in the shadows, the Holocaust. Nazi racial ideology, centered on Aryan supremacy, targeted Jews as the primary enemy. Persecution began with discriminatory laws, escalating as Germany conquered new territories. Mass shootings by Einsatzgruppen in Eastern Europe proved inefficient. The regime then industrialized death, designing camps for systematic extermination. This was not a military campaign, but a calculated genocide, a war against humanity itself, unfolding alongside the world's battlefields. On a cold January day in 1942, 15 high-ranking Nazi officials gathered at a lakeside villa outside Berlin. In a meeting lasting just 90 minutes, they coordinated the logistics of the final solution. The discussion was not about whether to murder Europe's Jews, but how to do it with bureaucratic efficiency. The plan was systematic: deport 11 million people to the east. Those deemed fit would be worked to death. The rest, women, children, the elderly, would be exterminated immediately. The Wannsee Conference transformed genocide into an industrial process. This machinery began with the walled ghettos, urban prisons of starvation and disease. The Warsaw Ghetto held nearly 500,000 souls, where clandestine schools and newspapers preserved dignity amidst despair. But the ghettos were only a temporary holding pen. The next phase was deportation. Families were crammed into cattle cars without food or water, told they were being relocated for work. Their journeys ended not at labor camps, but at the extermination centers of Auschwitz-Birkenau and Treblinka. Auschwitz was a complex of forced labor and industrialized killing. Upon arrival, prisoners underwent selection. The young and strong were sent to slow death through work. The others were marched directly to the gas chambers. Treblinka served a single, ghastly purpose: murder. Within hours of arrival, victims were stripped, led to chambers disguised as showers, and killed. Over 850,000 people were murdered there in little more than a year. The Holocaust was not senseless violence, but a coldly executed ideological project. The primary instrument of this terror was the SS under Heinrich Himmler. Evolving from Hitler's personal guard into a vast military and police empire, the SS embraced an ideology of racial purity and limitless brutality. They designed the camps, supervised deportations, and administered the genocide with terrifying discipline. The killing began even before the camps were built, with the Einsatzgruppenmobile death squads that followed the German army into the Soviet Union. Their method was primitive and intimate. Victims were marched to remote ravines, forced to dig their own graves, and shot. In less than 2 years, these squads murdered over 2 million people. The SS and its units were the dedicated executors of a twisted ideal. Their actions, a stark lesson in how hatred, when institutionalized, can commit crimes beyond comprehension. With the North African campaign concluded, the Allies turned to what Churchill called the soft underbelly of Europe, Italy. On July 9, 1943, Operation Husky commenced the massive amphibious invasion of Sicily. Nearly 500,000 Allied soldiers overwhelmed Italian and German defenses within a month. The defeat triggered a political collapse in Rome. On July 25, Mussolini was overthrown and arrested by his own fascist Grand Council. The new Italian government secretly negotiated an armistice with the Allies, announced. On September 8, Germany, anticipating betrayal, responded with swift brutality. German troops disarmed and captured Italian soldiers, turning Italy into a battlefield between former allies. Hitler then launched Operation Oak, a daring commando raid that rescued Mussolini from a mountain hotel. Installed as a puppet leader in northern Italy, Il Duce was now a mere figurehead. The German military, under the shrewd defensive strategist Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, prepared a tenacious resistance. He fortified the mountainous Italian terrain with a series of defensive lines, the most famous being the Gustav Line. The Allied advance toward Rome became a bloody, exhausting war of attrition, proving that the road north would be paid for in lives. Knowing the time had come for a decisive second front, the Allies planned Operation Overlord. On the cloudy dawn of June 6, 1944, the largest amphibious assault in history began on the beaches of Normandy. Hitler's Atlantic Wall was breached by 156,000 soldiers, 10,000 aircraft, and nearly 7,000 vessels. The element of surprise was crucial. The Germans expected an attack at Calais. American, British, and Canadian forces landed on 5 codenamed beaches: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. The long road to Berlin had begun. The Allies deceived Hitler through an elaborate disinformation campaign, Operation Fortitude, using inflatable tanks and false radio transmissions to convince him the invasion would come at Calais. Each beach on D-Day told a different story. At Utah Beach, American forces met relatively light resistance, aided by precise naval bombardment, and quickly linked up with airborne troops behind enemy lines. Omaha Beach, however, was a slaughterhouse. High tide had concealed German defenses, and failed bombing runs left bunkers intact. American soldiers were met with devastating machine gun and artillery fire, resulting in hours of brutal, personal combat for survival. It was here the Allies came closest to failure. Overcome only by sheer tenacity and heroism, the British and Canadian beaches, Gold, Juno, and Sword fared better, with Commonwealth troops consolidating their footholds and pushing inland. D-Day was not an instant victory, but a slow, brutal grind through Normandy. Yet the landing itself was a triumph, establishing a crucial beachhead in Nazi-occupied Europe and opening the vital Second Front. The noose around Hitler's Germany was tightening. Allied military leadership was pivotal. Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower, more diplomat and strategist than tactical genius, unified the coalition's formidable egos and coordinated the immense operation with calm pragmatism. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, meticulous and cautious, commanded all ground forces on D-Day. His detailed planning and methodical attacks pinned German panzer divisions, enabling the American breakout. General George S. Patton, the audacious tank commander, epitomized aggressive warfare. After the Normandy stalemate, his Third Army launched a lightning offensive across northern France, advancing so rapidly they often outran their supply lines. His boldness was unmatched and crucial to Allied victory. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet Red Army, having seized the initiative after Stalingrad, launched Operation Bagration on June 22, 1944. This massive offensive against German Army Group Center in Belarus was a strategic masterpiece. Soviet forces attacked across a 700-kilometer front, using pincer movements to encircle and annihilate German divisions. The success was staggering. Within weeks, Army Group Center was virtually destroyed, with over 500,000 German casualties. With the front shattered, the Red Army began its relentless, vengeful march toward Berlin, liberating concentration camps and revealing the full horror of Nazi crimes. By late 1944, Nazi Germany was desperate. With the Soviets advancing from the east and the Allies from the west, Hitler conceived one final, desperate gamble, a massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes to split the Allied armies. Launched on December 16, 1944, the Battle of the Bulge initially overwhelmed unprepared American forces. Yet, fierce resistance at key points, like the besieged town of Bastogne, slowed the German advance. When the weather cleared, Allied air power decimated German columns, and critical fuel shortages crippled the panzers. By late January 1945, the Germans were in retreat, having expended their last reserves. The failed offensive sealed the fate of the Third Reich. The end came in 1945, with the Allies crossing the Rhine and the Soviets at the gates of Berlin. The city was surrounded. The final Soviet assault began on April 16. The battle for the German capital was a street-by-street hellscape of ruin. Cowering in his bunker, a paranoid Hitler refused reality. On April 30, with Soviet troops mere meters away, he married Eva Braun and then committed suicide. She took cyanide. Their bodies were burned. Hitler's death was the regime's final act. On May 7, German General Alfred Jodl signed the unconditional surrender at Reims. The formal ratification followed in Berlin on May 8. The war in Europe was over. The document stipulated hostilities must cease across Europe by 11:01 p.m. on May 8, 1945. Yet for Stalin, the surrender at Reims was insufficient, a symbolic act not performed in the Third Reich's heart. He insisted German leaders sign a second document in Berlin on May 8, in a ceremony within the ruined capital. German Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel signed the final instrument of surrender. This act formally ended the war in Europe. The next day, the Soviet government declared the end of the Great Patriotic War, a victory date still celebrated across the former Soviet sphere. The signature was the period on a conflict that had devastated a continent. Nazism, with its thousand-year ambitions, had collapsed in just over 12. The world the 20th century had known was gone forever. Following the turning point at Midway, the Pacific War became a long, brutal campaign of slow, bloody advances. Allied forces embarked on an island-hopping strategy, inching closer to Japan. The battles for Iwo Jima and Okinawa epitomized this brutality. Iwo Jima, a small volcanic island, was crucial for its emergency airstrip. Okinawa would be the launch point for invading Japan's home island. The February 1945 battle for Iwo Jima was hell on earth. The Japanese, knowing they could not win, prepared to die constructing a labyrinth of tunnels and bunkers. U.S. Marines landed to an eerie quiet, then faced machine guns and artillery. They fought for every meter of volcanic rock for 5 weeks, in one of the deadliest battles in Marine Corps history. The Battle of Okinawa, beginning in April, was larger and bloodier. Nearly 280,000 Japanese soldiers faced over 500,000 Allied troops. The Japanese employed a defense in depth, and the battle lasted almost 3 months. It was a bloodbath, with fighting in mud and caves, kamikazes plunging into Allied ships. Casualties were massive. On Iwo Jima, over 26,000 Americans were wounded or killed. Of the 20,000 Japanese defenders, barely 200 were captured alive. On Okinawa, the Allies suffered over 65,000 casualties. The Japanese lost over 100,000 soldiers, and a great many civilians perished. The staggering human cost of these battles bred a profound dread of invading Japan's mainland. U.S. planners estimated an invasion, Operation Downfall, could result in 1 million Allied casualties and even more Japanese deaths. The Japanese people, indoctrinated in a code of death before dishonor, were prepared to fight to the last. Iwo Jima and Okinawa demonstrated that defeating Japan would come at an incalculable price. This grim reality was the decisive factor leading President Harry S. Truman to a choice that would change history: the use of an unprecedented weapon. Attention turned to a secret project years in development, the Manhattan Project. It was a massive, scientific and industrial effort, born from a 1939 letter from Albert Einstein, warning President Franklin Roosevelt of Nazi atomic ambitions. Its epicenter was the secret laboratory at Los Alamos, New Mexico, under the direction of the brilliant, charismatic physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer. The project cost billions and employed over 130,000 people at its peak, yet was kept so secret. Vice President Truman knew nothing of it until he became president in April 1945. On July 16, 1945, the project culminated in the first atomic detonation, the Trinity test. In the New Mexico desert, the terrifying success of the mushroom cloud confirmed the weapon was real. Truman now faced a monumental decision: order a bloody invasion of Japan, potentially costing 1 million lives, or use the most destructive weapon humanity had ever seen. Conceived to prevent Hitler's victory, the atomic bomb would become the weapon to end the war in the Pacific. On August 6, 1945, on a clear sunny morning, the American B-29 Enola Gay released a uranium bomb, Little Boy, over Hiroshima. A blinding light illuminated the sky, followed by a blast wave that destroyed everything within a kilometer. A giant atomic mushroom cloud rose in seconds. Most buildings were rubble. An estimated 70,000 people died instantly. Survivors suffered horrific burns or died days later from radiation, followed by a black rain of radioactive. Despite this devastation, the Japanese government refused to surrender. 3 days later, on August 9, another B-29 Boxcar carried a second more powerful plutonium bomb, Fat Man. Its primary target was Kokura, but due to poor visibility, it diverted to the secondary target, Nagasaki. The detonation was equally devastating, though the mountainous topography limited the destruction's reach. Over 40,000 people died immediately. The combined devastation of the two cities, coupled with the Soviet Union's entry into the war against Japan, forced Emperor Hirohito's intervention. On August 15, 1945, in an unprecedented address known as the Jewel Voice broadcast, the emperor spoke to his people by radio for the first time. He announced Japan's surrender, not mentioning defeat, but stating the war had developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage, and that the enemy had begun a new and most cruel bomb, alluding to a desire to save world civilization. He ended the war. The formal signing occurred on September 2, 1945, aboard the U.S. battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. Japanese Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu and General Yoshijiro Unezu signed the instrument of unconditional surrender. General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, signed for the Allies. This act officially marked the end of the Second World War. After nearly 6 years of global conflict, the largest and most destructive war in human history was over. Japan's defeat gave way to an era of reconstruction, the division of the world into two superpowers, and the long shadow of atomic power, marking the dawn of a new confrontation, the Cold War. The old order was gone. In February of 1945, with the war in Europe still raging, the three great leaders, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, met at Yalta. They discussed the fate of post-war Germany and Eastern Europe, agreeing to divide Germany into 4 occupation zones. Stalin promised free elections in the Eastern European nations. His Red Army was liberating and pledged to enter the war against Japan 3 months after Germany's surrender. By the Summer Potsdam Conference, the dynamics had shifted profoundly. Roosevelt was dead, replaced by Truman, and Churchill was replaced, mid-conference, by Attlee. Distrust between the Western leaders and Stalin was now evident. While the division of Germany was reaffirmed, Along with goals for demilitarization and denazification, the promise of free elections in the East was already fading. During the conference, Truman received word of the successful atomic test in New Mexico, a revelation that granted him immense confidence, but seeded deep paranoia in Stalin, who accelerated the Soviet nuclear program. The Second World War had destroyed the old powers. Britain and France, though victorious, were economically ruined, their colonial empires in decline. This power vacuum was filled by two nations that emerged not just intact but more powerful than ever. The United States stood as an undisputed superpower, its homeland untouched, its industrial might unrivaled, and now the sole possessor of the atomic bomb. Its ideology of liberal democracy and capitalism was projected as a beacon. The Soviet Union, despite catastrophic human loss and destruction, commanded the world's largest army and controlled half of Europe. Communism presented itself as the alternative. Stalin, seeking a Soviet security bloc, established communist regimes in Eastern Europe, creating an iron curtain that divided the continent. The conferences conceived to secure peace had instead laid the groundwork for a new kind of conflict, a Cold War of ideologies, propaganda, and a nuclear arms race. The Allies who had fought Hitler now eyed each other with suspicion. The world balanced on the brink of a nuclear abyss. With the war's end came an unprecedented dilemma: how to hold the leaders of a regime guilty of unimaginable crimes accountable. The answer was the Nuremberg trials, held in the city that once hosted Nazi party rallies. An international military tribunal, with judges and prosecutors from the USMRG, Britain, the Soviet Union, and France, tried the major Nazi officials. The aim was to establish that no one, regardless of rank, was above the law. The defendants faced four principal charges: crimes against peace, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and conspiracy. Their defense, that they were merely following orders, was rejected, establishing the principle that obedience to superiors does not absolve individual responsibility. While criticized as victor's justice, Nuremberg's impact on international law was profound. It set the historic precedent that individuals, not just states, could be held criminally responsible for international crimes. Concepts like crimes against humanity were defined and put into practice, forming the bedrock of modern international criminal law. The legacy was both punishment and a warning, demonstrating that the world could unite to prosecute atrocity. Today's International Criminal Court is a direct heir to the principles established in that courtroom, marking the end of the war and an attempt to build a more just world. Recognizing the need for a global organization to mediate conflict and prevent another total war, the failed League of Nations was replaced by the United Nations. Its charter was drafted by delegates from 50 countries at the San Francisco Conference between April and June 1945, signed on June Luth, and came into force on October 7. Its primary objective, stated in the Charter's preamble, was to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. Designed to have the power to act, its key structure included the General Assembly, a forum for all member states, and the powerful Security Council charged with maintaining international peace and security, empowered to impose sanctions and authorize military force. Its 15 members include 5 permanent ones: the USS, ISIS, UK, ISIS, France, China, and the Soviet Union. Now Russia, each wielding a veto power that has been debated and criticized. Other organs include the International Court of Justice and specialized agents. While criticized for inefficiency and power struggles, the UN has helped avert conflicts and has been key in promoting human rights, humanitarian aid, and development. Its creation was the final act of the Second World War, an attempt by nations to learn from the past and build a more peaceful future. The unity of the victors faded quickly after the war. The ideological divide between the two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, became insurmountable, splitting the world in two. This new conflict, without direct military confrontation, would be known as the Cold War. Tensions were made public in March 1946, when Winston Churchill, with President Truman at his side, delivered his famous speech in Fulton, Missouri, declaring, "From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent." This metaphor symbolized the physical and ideological division of Europe. To the west lay the capitalist democracies under U.S. influence. To the east, the nations, liberated by the Red Army, now fell under strict Soviet control, forming the Eastern Bloc with puppet governance. This curtain would later become physically real with walls, wire, and minefields, culminating in the Berlin Wall. The Cold War was formalized in 1947 with the Truman Doctrine, a policy of communist containment, promising economic and military aid to threatened nations like Greece and Turkey. It was complemented by the Marshall Plan, a massive economic aid program to rebuild Western Europe, aiming to prevent the spread of communism and create markets for American goods. The Soviet response was to consolidate its control over the Eastern Bloc and create its own military and economic alliances. The Cold War became a nuclear arms race, with conflicts fought through proxies in Korea, Vietnam, and Afghanistan. The end of the Second World War did not bring lasting peace, but the beginning of a dangerous confrontation that would dominate the decades to come. From the rise of dictators and the brutality of the Blitzkrieg, through the heroism of Stalingrad and Midway, to the nightmare of the extermination camps and the shadow of the atomic bomb, this war left a legacy of ashes. It also left a crucial lesson on the fragility of peace, the resilience of the human spirit, and the eternal struggle between light and darkness. This is a story we must never forget.